important cities and important features of American popular culture, but we also have some amazing natural beauty here in the United States. And some of these parks are very famous, and some of them are a little less famous, I think, to people outside of the United States. So today we're going to be talking about two national parks, Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. So first, I want to give a little background on the National Park Service. So this is an organization which was created, many years ago, and it oversees the various parks that we're going to talk about. It has about 20,000 employees, and the working for the National Park Service is a very coveted thing. So I know that I've had students, because I teach history, who want to work for the National Park Service, and those are coveted positions. So you can see from the list below here that the National Park Service oversees not only the national parks like we're going to talk about today, but also national preserves, conservation areas, wildlife refuges, historical sites like Lincoln's birthplace, battlefields, and memorials like Mount Rushmore. And it also includes a lot of museums, and some of these museums are quite small, but they're really nice. And at least my experience has been in encountering people who work for the National Park Service in these various places. They always are very enthusiastic about the place that they work, and I guess that's because you have to really want these jobs. And they're very excited to share what they know about the park or about the museum or about the area with the people who visit. So years ago we went to one that was Edgar Allan Poe's, someplace Edgar Allan Poe had lived, and they had the best staff there, and it was the tiniest museum, but they were so excited to have visitors and to talk to us about Edgar Allan Poe and his history. So the National Park Service covers all of these things, and as I said, there's a reason people want to work in this service. It's a wonderful job for people who enjoy history and nature and want to be able to share that with other people. So just to give us a little bit of orientation, so we know where we're talking about, here are a couple of maps. So you can see Yellowstone is in the upper western corner of Wyoming, and it goes a tiny bit of it goes into Montana here, but you can see that the bulk of it is in Wyoming. And then, of course, the map on the right shows you where that would be in the larger United States. So just so that we know where we're talking about. So Yellowstone, as a national park, was established in 1872 by Teddy Roosevelt. It was the first national park. So it was the beginning of the entire concept of national parks. And last time someone had asked what the motivation was, and I had kind of answered that question based on what I knew. And I went back and double checked and read a little bit on it, and I was absolutely correct. So there was a growing understanding at this point at the end of the 19th century that nature would not be there forever if we didn't take care of it. So this is the time when there was a rising awareness of the decline of the bison herds in the United States. They had been overhunted by not by the Native Americans, who were pretty good about, actually using everything that they killed, but by American, wealthier American tourists who went out west once the railroads were established, and just went on these buffalo hunts and just killed from the train, even sometimes without, even using the buffalo. So those herds were declining. There was a growing awareness of that. The ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Animals, even was a voice in urging people to take this kind of thing more seriously. And then, of course, as Americans expanded westward, they encountered these beautiful sights and recognized at some point that, these areas were going to be destroyed if they weren't protected. And so that was the inspiration behind the creation of the National Park Service. Now, Yellowstone is a very large park. It's about 3,500 square miles. Um, and it sits on top of an active volcano. So probably if you know anything about Yellowstone, you know about its geysers and all of these hot pits within the park. And all of that is created by the heat generated by this volcano. So the Yellowstone super volcano, which lies under the park, apparently, our scientists estimate, erupted about 640,000 years ago. That's a long time, but it's generating all of this heat, which creates all of these amazing natural features. Now, Yellowstone has more than 10,000 geothermal features, and about 500 of these are geysers. And this actually, Yellowstone contains more than half the world's geysers. So the only other places that have, a lot of geysers like Yellowstone are places in Siberia, Chile, Iceland, and New Zealand. Now, the most famous geyser is the one that I have pictured here. This is called Old Faithful. And the reason it has that name is because it erupts pretty regularly, usually about every 90 minutes. But sometimes it can be, maybe 20 minutes, or sometimes it can be 2 hours. So when you go to visit Yellowstone, almost without fail, everybody at some point is going to go and wait by Old Faithful to see that big eruption. And it is very tall when it erupts, and it's a pretty impressive sight. So you might have to wait 2 hours, but it will erupt. And that is why it's called Old Faithful, right? Because we know it's going to erupt every couple of hours at the very least. Now, a geyser is a rare kind of hot spring that's under pressure. And it erupts, sending jets of water and steam into the air. So this happens because there's a tube-like hole in the Earth's surface that runs deep into the crust, and this tube is filled with water. And so the molten rock at the very bottom of that tube, which is of course called magma, heats that water, and eventually it becomes super hot. Eventually that water begins to boil, and then some of the water is forced upward, and that boiling water begins to steam and turn to gas, and eventually the steam jet erupts through the surface and ejects a column of water above it, and this all goes up into the air. And as I said, it's a pretty impressive sight, and everyone enjoys seeing that. And there is actually a hotel situated right across from Old Faithful, and the rooms there, not surprisingly, are more expensive, but you can get a room there where you can actually then, watch the geyser go off multiple times during your stay. All right. So here's some of the other geothermal features that we see in Yellowstone. These are, various hot springs and pools. These are cordoned off. These are close-up pictures, but there are barriers around these things. They're very hot. You're not supposed to go in them. You're not supposed to go near them, and there are lots of warning signs, but occasionally someone does something stupid. And I was joking before we started the presentation that I wondered if it was only Americans who were this stupid, or because it seems that most of the stories I read, it's not visitors, it's a local, I mean, it's not local, but it's Americans who are doing this. It's not people from other countries who are somehow not reading the signs, but so there recently, very recently, right, just a couple of months ago, a 23-year-old guy died because he fell into one of these hot springs, and he was completely dissolved within a day. So you are not supposed to go near these things. And but yet it happens on a pretty regular, well, not very regular, but it does happen often enough. And I just thought it was interesting as I was preparing these presentations that some of these stories were happening while I was preparing. Um, Now there are some other gorgeous features in the park. So this, for example, is called the Blue Pool. Just stunning, stunning blue water. Again, though, you're not allowed to go into any of these bodies of water. Now there are places where you're allowed to go, but most of these features you're not. This is not like going to Iceland where you can get into the lovely pools at spas. This is a national park, so you're not allowed to do that. Um, there are also many beautiful geological and water features in the park. So there are about 290 waterfalls in Yellowstone Park. And also there are lots of very interesting mineral formations. So the photograph on the right shows that. Limestone is often absorbed into or dissolved into the hot water, and then it's deposited. And when it cools, it turns into travertine, and it makes these beautiful deposits that look kind of like drippy, almost like wax, right? It looks like hardened wax dripping off the side of a candle. And I mean, there's so many photographs of this if you want to go look at more of them online, and they're really quite beautiful. Now, of course, this park is also really known for its wildlife. And so as people go through the park, they are very likely to encounter animals, and usually, at pretty close distances. So some of the animals that you're likely to see are the ones pictured here. Bears. And by the way, I took all these pictures when I was there myself. So, you really are likely to see a lot of animals. And that's one of the fun things about visiting the park, is that the animals are out and about during the daytime. And as you're driving through this park in particular, when you see cars pulling off to the side of the road, you can be almost certain that there is an animal out there, and everybody's getting there to take the pictures. So that's your cue to pull off as well. You are, though, supposed to stay in your car for the most part to stay away from the animals, and we'll talk about that later. You also might see other animals like elk, moose. There are wolves and coyotes in this park as well, and then lots of smaller mammals, marmots and other things like that are all over the park as well. The park has, oops, let me go back. The park has lots of hiking trails and campsites. So if a person loves to do that kind of thing, there are plenty of opportunities to do that here. Of course, there are also some hotels you can stay in. And for the most part, you can drive through the park and see a lot of what you want to see. Every place you go will have these little sort of pull-offs where you can park your car and get out and walk over to these pathways to see these bubbling pits and things like that. And then you get back in your car and you drive a little further to the next site. So it really is, I think I mentioned this in the last presentation as well. A lot of these parks really have done a good job of making things accessible for people with various levels of mobility. So, even if you have someone who's in a wheelchair, there are ramps to facilitate visiting by lots of people of, different levels of mobility and experience. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is the Grand Canyon. And I will tell you that before I saw the Grand Canyon, I thought, how impressive can this be? It's just a big hole in the ground, right? And then I went there and I was like, wow, it really is breathtakingly beautiful and so big, it's kind of hard to comprehend. So the Grand Canyon was established as a park in 1919, and the area encompasses about 1.2 million acres, which is about 5,000 square kilometers. It's bigger than the entire state of Rhode Island. So it is a really massive area. And this is one of the parks that gets the most visitors. It gets about 6.2 million visitors. Now, the first sighting of the Grand Canyon is recorded by Europeans. It's credited to Francisco Coronado, who on his expedition of 1540 encountered the Grand Canyon. But then, of course, in the early 1800s, as you had trappers and others, moving west, looking to exploit the possibilities there, they began to encounter the canyon and examine it. And eventually, the United States government became involved in expeditions to try and map out the canyon, to explore and map out the west part of the United States. And so they began to record information about it. In 1869, American geologist and anthropologist John Wesley Powell organized the first party to travel the canyon by boat, because there is a river at the bottom. We'll talk about that in a second. And by the 1870s, there were extensive reports being published about the area. So let me go to the next slide just to sort of situate us here again. Here's our location in the United States where the Grand Canyon is located. Now, in 1893, President Benjamin Harrison set aside a portion of the canyon as a forest reserve. But finally, in 1903, Theodore Roosevelt redesignated this area as a game preserve, and then finally it became a national monument in 1908. And then, as I said before, in 1919, Congress declared it a national park. Now, the Grand Canyon was created by the Colorado River. So obviously, over many, many, many years, the Colorado River carved this enormous canyon out. It's believed that the Colorado River began carving the Grand Canyon about 6 million years ago. But in 2012, a study suggested that the process might have even gone back further, something like 70 million years. The Colorado River itself runs for almost 300 miles. So it's an important water source, an important river in that area. However, I was surprised to find this out when I was doing my research. The Grand Canyon is not the deepest canyon in the world. There is actually one canyon that is deeper, a canyon in Tibet, the Yarlung Tsangpo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Has a depth of 18,000 feet. While the Grand Canyon is only 6,000 feet deep. So this is a deep, deep canyon, but there's one canyon that is significantly bigger than the Grand Canyon. There's just another photograph of the canyon. So you can see one of the things that's most beautiful about the canyon is that you can see the various layers of the deposits that were created in this area. And then, of course, when the river carved it out, now all of those are exposed. So you can see the different layers of rock, the different deposits that were deposited there and made these beautiful layers in the rock that are very colorful in some cases and very distinct. So if you're a person who appreciates a little bit of geology, even if you don't know that much about it, it's very interesting to see these various layers. And of course, the layers, because they are different types of rock, erode at different rates. And so that's how you end up with a lot of these really beautiful formations. And in some of the subsequent presentations that we'll do, we'll talk about that as well, how some of the really unusual features in some of the other parks are because some rocks are harder than others, so the erosion takes place at different rates. One thing that's interesting to know is there actually is a town in the Grand Canyon. So it's a village, a Supai village located at the base of the Grand Canyon. It's within an Indian reservation, and it is only accessible by the river and by pack mule. So this is one of the only places it is the only place in the United States where mail is still delivered by pack mule, and it's the most remote community in the contiguous 48 states. People do hike all the way down to the bottom of the canyon, but it is a long hike, obviously. There is a place down there that I think it's called the Ghost Ranch, where you can actually spend the night. But of course, because it's not very big, you have to make reservations far in advance. So that's a pretty significant endeavor if you're going to hike down there and spend the night. But people do, are allowed to do that. Here's just another beautiful photograph of that stratification where you can see, in this picture, you can see there's actually a hole cut in the rock, and there are people standing there. So just some of the beautiful features within the canyon. Now, this is a fairly new addition. So this was built since I was there, and it is run by a Native American group. They own part of the land that it's built on, and so they built this. It's a money maker for them, and it is an arch walkway that has a glass bottom. So when you are out there on the curve of that arch, you can look down into the canyon. So if you're afraid of heights, it is not someplace you would want to go. But I think it would be pretty amazing. And whenever I get to go back to the Grand Canyon, I definitely would want to do that. But I think it's just another interesting way to see the canyon. A lot of people, by the way, see the canyon in helicopter tours. So that's something that you can pay for. And they will take you out over the canyon in a helicopter. And then, of course, like I said, most people do, hike if they're going to go see the Grand Canyon. Hiking the Grand Canyon, however, is not an easy thing. So you can see on the left, the pathways, the paths you walk down are very narrow. So again, it's not for the faint of heart, not for someone who is afraid of heights. And you can also go on mule. And so when you are on foot on one of these paths, and other people are coming up or down on mules, you have to somehow squeeze over and make room for the mules. Now, people say these mules are incredibly sure-footed. They've done this forever. They know what they're doing. Personally, I would not ride a mule on one of these narrow paths, but I am also a bit of a control freak. So if I'm going to die in the Grand Canyon, it will be because I slipped, not because a mule slipped. But a lot of people do this. They do take these tours on the mules because it's a really arduous trek to go on foot into the Grand Canyon. And one thing that people, professionals recommend is that you take into account that it takes twice as long to come back up as it does to go down. So if it takes 6 hours, I think I remember reading it takes something like 6 hours, 6 or 7 hours to walk down to the bottom of the canyon, it's going to take twice that long to get back up, because not only are you going up, but you're also tired now. And so you have to bring lots of water with you. There are no sources of water between the top of the Grand Canyon and the bottom where the river is. So if you get halfway down and you change your mind, you have to turn around and go back up, but you're not going to be able to find any extra water. And in fact, one of the things that happens sometimes is that people get disoriented. They get halfway down, they're overheating, they don't realize, they get lost, they get confused because they decide they need to turn around and go back up. And people have died from that. So this brings me to the last slide that I've been including in all of these presentations, which is a slide about planning and about safety. So all of these parks have, various restrictions and limitations that you need to be aware of. So if you're ever coming to visit, you want to make sure to check out when these parks are open and close. And I'm not talking about days, I'm talking about times of the year. You want to check the weather, because of course in some of the parks that are a little more northern, at certain points in the year, they're closed because of snow. You definitely need to find out about the passes. Some of these parks actually have been restricting entry to a certain number of people per day because they don't want to overload the park. And then, of course, park accommodations like campsites and hotels fill up far in advance. So you can't, decide next month that you're going to go to one of these places and expect to find a hotel room, right? The other thing, of course, is being safe. So as we've talked about before, you know, uh, follow the park rules regarding safety barriers. So, you could tell just from those slides I showed you that there are some very, very steep inclines in the Grand Canyon and in Yellowstone. There are areas where it's very easy to lose your footing and fall. And there are barriers, but the barriers are not walls. It's just maybe like a little fence and it says, don't go beyond this point. They're trusting you to have some common sense. And yet every year somebody falls, and a lot of time lately, it's a lot of people trying to take selfies. So you have to be careful about that, right? And then, of course, stay away from the animals. So you're not supposed to go near these animals. The bison, for example, that's a picture of a woman getting hit, rammed by a bison. The bison can run, I think it's 6 times faster than humans. So even though they look big and bulky, they're actually really fast. And then, of course, with the Grand Canyon, because hiking is such a big part of the Grand Canyon and it's so rugged there, water is critical. And when you actually read the guidebooks on how much water you're supposed to bring, it's a little, I have to say, it makes you wonder whether or not you should try and do it unless you're an incredibly young and healthy person, because you have to bring a lot of water, so much more than you think you would. So that's definitely something to always think about. And then literally, right, I told you as I was preparing these presentations, new stories keep appearing. And so I'm adding them to the presentation as I go along. So literally this month, a man died after attempting an illegal base jump with a parachute off of the south rim of the Grand Canyon. So there are rules in place for a reason. And just to demonstrate that lots of people have died in the Grand Canyon, not always from stupidity, sometimes just, accidents. There are 2 books that are dedicated to this, one on death in Yellowstone, one on death in the Grand Canyon. And as I said, some people have heart attacks, some people lose their footing, sort of normal things that you would expect. But there are a lot of stories in here about people just being kind of stupid and not following the basic rules. So that's my last slide there. Don't be an idiot, right? And then just, does anyone have any questions? And it looks like Victoria is the only person here at the moment, I think, that we can see watching, right? Okay, let's see. Thank you for what types of outdoor activities in ecotourism. So as I was saying, there's a lot of hiking. And I would say that's probably the biggest thing in the Grand Canyon. Most people don't do that because it's pretty ambitious. And if you're traveling with little kids, you can't do that kind of thing. So when I was there, I was traveling with little kids. There are lots of places you can pull over and get very good views, but there is a lot of hiking and camping. And then some people also take trips on the river, the Colorado River at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. That's another thing. So there are actually organized trips you can take where you hike all the way down to the bottom, and then you join up with a group on a boat, on rafts, and then you raft